The helicopter came out of nowhere. One minute we were eating lunch like any other Tuesday. The next, the cafeteria windows shook, trays crashed to the floor, and every head turned toward the sky. People screamed. Some ducked under tables. But I didn't move. I just sat there staring out the window. Because I knew that Black Hawk wasn't here by accident. And it wasn't here for anyone else. They had come for me. It didn't start like that, of course. It started that morning quiet, gray, and cold, like the air itself didn't want to be awake. I sat on the edge of my bed, lacing up the boots that weren't mine. The leather was cracked at the ankle. The soles were heavy. They squeaked when I walked. They were his. Dad's. There were 2 days a year I wore them, November 11th and today mattered more. It had been exactly 1 year. 1 year since we got that knock on the door. 1 year since my mom dropped the mug she was holding, shattering it on the tile. 1 year since a man in uniform removed his hat, lowered his voice, and told us my dad was never coming home. A convoy ambush. Afghanistan. He was supposed to be the one calling the shots, not the one taking the hit. But he stayed back to help a wounded soldier get to cover, and in that moment, he became the casualty. We got a folded flag, a letter, and silence. So today I wore his boots. Just the boots, not the jacket, not the tags. Just one piece of him. One piece that still smelled like oil and dust and desert wind. My mom saw me in the hallway and stopped. Her lips parted like she might say something, but all she did was nod, the kind of nod that says, "I get it, baby. I miss him too." On the bus, no one said anything, but I felt it, eyes drifting down to the boots, then up to my face, then away again, as if looking too long would confirm something uncomfortable. I didn't care. I wasn't there for them. I was just getting through the day. At first it was okay, just stares, whispers, a few snickers behind open palms. Then second period came. A kid named Jackson, who thinks he's hilarious, leaned over and muttered, "Yo, Private Ryan, you lose your way to boot camp." His buddies laughed like it was the best joke since sliced bread. I said nothing. By third period, someone had slipped a sticky note onto my locker, written in thick black marker, "LARPing much." I crumpled it and stuffed it in my pocket. At lunch, things escalated. I sat at the end of the table near the wall like I always do. I wasn't trying to make a statement. But that's when Emily Carter, the unofficial queen of the junior class, walked by with her tray and said just loud enough for the room to hear, "Guess someone's auditioning for Most Likely to Storm Normandy." The laughter spread like wildfire. Quick, sharp. I kept my eyes on my sandwich. I didn't flinch. That's when the first thud hit the air. Low, distant, rhythmic. Most people didn't notice at first, but I did. Because you don't forget that sound when it's been drilled into your life, when you've heard it in nightmares, when you've watched it lower your father into the ground. It was a helicopter. Not just any helicopter. A Black Hawk. And it was getting closer. Within seconds, the room shook. Students dropped their forks. Teachers came running. The windows behind me rattled in their frames. Someone screamed, "Is this a lockdown?" Another shouted, "Is this real?" But I already knew the answer. Because no one else here had a dad who served 17 years in the army. No one else here had been handed a box that smelled like dust and goodbyes. And no one else here was wearing his boots. That Black Hawk was here for me. By the time I stepped into the hallway, the school had turned upside down. Students were pressed against windows, phones raised, filming the helicopter that now hovered above the football field. Teachers were shouting, trying to maintain order, but no one listened. The hallway buzzed with a kind of electricity I'd never felt before. Part panic, part curiosity, part something else entirely. No one had figured out why it was here yet. But I had. I moved slowly, hoping to disappear into the crowd. But it was too late. The boots squeaked against the linoleum with every step giving me away like drum beats in a silent cathedral. A few students turned, then more, eyes locked on me, some confused, some amused, and just a few seemed to realize something was about to happen. I kept walking, until the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention students and faculty. Would Zoe Harper please report to the main office immediately?" The crowd went dead silent. All the noise, the whispers, the laughter, the hum of phones stopped. You could hear a pin drop. Then someone gasped, "Zoe." Another voice I couldn't tell who said, "Wait, is that her?" The hallway split down the middle as people moved aside, forming a path without being told. I walked through it like I was in a dream I couldn't wake up from, my chest tight, my face burning. I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. And yet, somewhere deep in my bones, I knew my dad would have walked this path without hesitation. So I did. Every step I took felt heavier, not because of the boots, but because of the weight of memory, of grief, of everything unspoken between a girl and her father who left with promises and never came home. Flashback. I was 11 when he taught me how to polish boots. He sat cross-legged in the garage, the sun slanting through the open door. He handed me a brush and said, "There's pride in this, Zoe, even if no one sees it." Especially then. I didn't understand what he meant back then. But I did now. I reached the front office. The secretary stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, mid-call. She looked at me like I'd grown wings. "Zoe," she stammered. "They're waiting for you. Outside." I turned toward the doors. Glass panes showed a dozen figures in dress uniforms standing in formation on the football field. The helicopter hovered just above the ground, now its downdraft whipping grass and dust into the air. One of them stepped forward, a woman with sharp shoulders, silver hair pulled into a regulation bun, and a chest full of medals that gleamed in the sunlight. She wasn't here for a show. She was here for something real. Inside the building, students rushed to every vantage point. Phones pressed to glass. Teachers, too. Some mouths hung open. A few were already crying, even if they didn't know why yet. That's the thing about truth. When it shows up like that in a roar of blades and brass buttons, you feel it even if you don't fully understand it. Just as I reached for the door, someone grabbed my arm. It was Emily Carter. Her voice for the first time wasn't smug. It wasn't sarcastic. It was small. "Zoe, what's going on?" I looked at her, not angry, not triumphant, just tired. "It's been exactly 1 year," I said quietly. "Today's the day my father died saving 12 other soldiers. You laughed at his boots, but now you'll hear his name." I didn't wait for a response. I stepped outside and let the wind take me. The wind from the helicopter hit like a wall, hot, dry, loud. It tugged at my clothes, blew strands of hair into my face, and made it nearly impossible to think. But I kept walking. The officers standing on the field parted as I approached. In the center stood the woman I'd seen through the office window, tall, composed uniform, pristine. She looked at me the way no one else had all day, not with confusion or pity or curiosity, but with understanding. She extended her hand. "Colonel Diana Reese," she said, her voice steady even over the noise. "I served with your father." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Zoe Harper." "I know," she said gently. "We're here for you." Behind me, the helicopter's rotors began to slow. The roar softened to a mechanical whir. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had ever been. Then the colonel turned to the crowd. Microphones had been set up. Someone, a teacher maybe, had run out and connected the field's PA system. Her voice rang out over the stadium like a sermon. "Students and faculty of Lincoln High, I thank you for your attention. Today we are here to honor a man who many of you never knew, but one of you did. One of you knew him not as a soldier, but as a father." Her voice was calm, clear. No notes, No teleprompter, just memory. She told them about Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, his 17 years of service, his deployments, the commendations. But more than that, she spoke of him as a man, a leader, a friend who carried photos of his daughter in his chest pocket, a soldier who volunteered for the mission that would ultimately take his life not out of duty, but because he believed fiercely in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As she spoke, I stood beside her frozen, not from fear, but from disbelief. Because somehow the stories I'd only heard in whispers, the things Mom didn't have the strength to say, were now being spoken into microphones, into open air, into history. Flashback. A week after the funeral, I found the box. It was hidden in the back of Dad's closet, marked only with my name. Inside was a letter. The handwriting slanted and neat. Zoe, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. I'm sorry. You deserved more time. But I want you to know wearing these boots doesn't make you me. It makes you brave enough to remember me. That's all I ever hoped for. Never forget who you are, and never let them forget who we were. Dad. Colonel Reese's voice brought me back. She was finishing now. A staff sergeant walked forward carrying a large wooden case and a folded flag in his arms. My breath caught. We are here, she said, to present Zoe Harper with the flag that was flown over her father's base the day he fell, and with the Bronze Star awarded posthumously for his extraordinary bravery under fire. He placed the items in my arms. They were heavy, not in weight, but in what they meant. Behind me, I could hear it. Sniffles. The hush of 1,000 students who had just witnessed something they didn't have words for. Somewhere a teacher cried openly. Even the principal had his hand over his heart. And then I heard something I didn't expect. Clapping. It started with one teacher, then another, then the bleachers, and suddenly the whole field. But it wasn't applause like at a pep rally. It was slow, measured, respectful. The kind of applause you only give when you realize you've been in the presence of something you almost didn't see. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the edge of the crowd. Emily was there. Tears streamed down her face. She wasn't filming. She wasn't laughing. She was standing. Still. Silent. Changed. Back inside, when the field had cleared and the helicopter had lifted off, I returned to my locker. My hands were shaking. The boots felt heavier now, not because they were too much, but because they finally belonged somewhere. There was a note taped to my locker door. Same black marker. Same handwriting as the one from before. But this time it read, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just took it down and folded it carefully, because maybe that too was part of remembering. The next morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. Not because the sky had changed, or because the air smelled cleaner, but because something inside me had shifted subtly, permanently. I used to dread walking into that school. Yesterday, I walked across the football field holding my father's folded flag. Today, I still carried it, just not in my hands. I carried it in my spine, in my steps, in the way no one dared meet my eyes with ridicule anymore. When I stepped onto the school bus, no one said a word. And for the first time, it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like reverence. Second period, something even stranger happened. Mr. Holcomb, the history teacher, who'd once told me you might want to keep the camo at home, pulled me aside after class. He looked nervous. I served too, he said quietly. Desert Storm. Your father. I didn't know. You did something powerful yesterday. Something brave. He paused. Thank you for reminding this place what real sacrifice looks like. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. At lunch, I sat in my usual corner, the spot no one ever joined. But this time 2 people did. Carlos from AP Chem and Misha, the quiet girl who always wore headphones. They didn't say much. just sat near me, ate their food, shared their space. It was enough. But the biggest surprise came during 6th period. Just as I was settling into my seat in English class, the intercom crackled overhead. "Attention students and staff." The principal said, his voice unusually composed. "I'd like to take a moment before the end of the day to acknowledge something important. Something we all witnessed yesterday, something that has deeply affected our school community." The classroom went still. As many of you know, Zoe Harper, one of our students, was honored by members of the United States Army on this campus. What you may not have known is that her father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, gave his life in service to this country just 1 year ago. All eyes turned to me. Zoe chose to remember her father quietly through action, not words, through presence, not performance. But yesterday, that silence became a statement none of us will forget. Even the teacher put down her pen. So, with the permission of Zoe's family and the United States Department of Defense Lincoln High, we'll formally recognize October 17th as Staff Sergeant Harper Day, a day of remembrance for all students who carry legacies greater than themselves. My heart stopped. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. Not with fear, with something else. Gratitude, relief, maybe even joy. Not because they were honoring me, but because they were finally saying his name. Out loud. Flashback. The night before his final deployment, Dad sat beside me on the porch. It was chilly. He handed me a thermos of hot cocoa and said, "You know, if something ever happens, I just want you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't make your life about my death, but don't hide from it either. If you ever need to wear my boots, wear them proud." At the time, I thought he meant literally, but now I knew better. He meant every step I'd ever take without him. After school, the hallway was a slow-moving tide of stunned silence and gentle nods. Some students smiled at me softly. Some stopped me just to say thank you. But it wasn't until I reached my locker that I saw it. Someone had taped a small American flag to the door. Below it, a note. "He would be proud of you." It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. It wasn't supposed to happen again. The ceremony, the soldiers, the helicopter, that was supposed to be a one-time moment. A single, unforgettable flash of recognition in a life otherwise spent quietly remembering. But 3 days after the announcement, I was called to the office again. This time they weren't asking for a meeting. They were asking for a speech. The Department of Defense had reached out. Colonel Reese herself had nominated me to say a few words at the district-wide Veterans Day event to be held on Lincoln High's football field. 10 schools invited. Thousands of attendees. I wanted to say no, but I remembered my dad's last letter, the one tucked into the bottom of his box. "Speak when it matters, Zoe, and it always matters when you're the only one who can say it." So I said yes. The day of the ceremony, the field looked like something out of a presidential event. Rows of white chairs, flags at half-mast, bleachers packed, veterans in uniforms with rows of medals, students who didn't even go to Lincoln High craning to get a look, TV crews, tripods, boom mics, and me standing behind a wooden podium that looked way too tall for a 17-year-old girl with shaking hands. But I wasn't standing there as a student anymore. I was standing there as a daughter. Colonel Reese introduced me. She spoke with pride in her voice, calling me a living example of what remembrance truly means. Then she stepped aside, and it was just me, the wind, the microphone, and the silence of thousands of people waiting. I took a breath and began. "My name is Zoe Harper. Most of you didn't know my father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, but I did. I knew how he made the best pancakes on Sundays. I knew he wore mismatched socks on purpose just to make me laugh. I knew the sound of his boots coming up the driveway after a long deployment, and one day I knew what it felt like to answer the door and have someone else wearing those boots tell me he wasn't coming home." The field was silent. Even the air seemed to pause. For a long time I didn't talk about him, not because I wasn't proud, but because I didn't think anyone wanted to hear about a girl whose dad died in a place they couldn't find on a map. And when I wore his boots to school on the anniversary of his death, some people laughed. They didn't know what those boots meant. But then something happened. I looked out into the crowd. The army showed up, not to protect me, but to remind everyone else that some stories shouldn't be forgotten, and some names deserve to be spoken even after the people behind them are gone. In the front row, my mother was crying, her hands folded over her heart. Behind her, I saw teachers, stoic, serious teachers dabbing their eyes. I continued, "Today you're going to hear a lot of names. You're going to see a lot of flags and medals. But I want you to remember this. For every name you hear, there's a child who once stayed up all night waiting to hear their father's voice on the phone. For every folded flag, there's a mother who still sets an extra plate at dinner. For every medal, there's a family who wakes up every day trying to live a life worthy of someone who can't anymore." And then I ended with the only words I knew would be enough. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, my father, my hero. He's not forgotten, and neither is anyone else as long as we keep saying their names. When I finished, I looked up. The entire field was standing. Not just students. Not just veterans. Everyone. Even the janitor who usually swept the hall in silence had tears on his cheeks. The applause was thunderous, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was my dad's voice in my head. "You wore the boots, Zoe, and you made them walk somewhere they'd never been before." The ceremony ended, but something in me had just begun. After the applause faded and the flags were lowered, I stood alone for a moment at midfield, holding my father's folded flag in both hands. The spotlights dimmed. The crowd dispersed. But I stayed, because that's when I finally understood something. It was never really about me. It was about him, and all the names like his, the ones carved into stone, folded into flags, hidden in drawers, never said out loud. Until now. The next few days at school were surreal. People who had never spoken to me started stopping in the halls. They didn't want to talk about war or politics or even the speech. They wanted to talk about their dads, their uncles, their grandmothers who served as nurses in Vietnam, their cousins who never came back. It was like something had opened, not just in them, but in all of us. Flashback. The first time I saw my dad cry was the day his best friend didn't make it home. I was 8. He sat on the back porch looking out at nothing with a bottle of root beer in one hand and the other clenched tight around a photo. He didn't say much. He was the kind of man whose name should never disappear. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. Now I did. By the following Monday, something new appeared on the bulletin board outside the principal's office. A white sheet of paper titled, "Names We Remember." Below it were photos of parents, grandparents, siblings who had served. Each name was handwritten with a black marker, and at the bottom of the list in bold, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, U.S. Army father of Zoe Harper, junior class. I stood in front of it longer than I meant to. Behind me, someone cleared their throat. I turned. It was Mr. Giles, the janitor. "I knew your dad," he said quietly. "Before I came here, Afghanistan, different base, same mission. He once gave up his sleeping bag so a rookie medic could stay warm through the night." I blinked. He nodded. "I never said anything before. Didn't know how, but you should know. He wasn't just a good soldier. He was a good man." And then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, he saluted me. Later that week, Emily Carter, that Emily asked to sit with me at lunch. She didn't apologize, not with words. But she brought a sandwich she made herself, and she sat quietly, and she let me talk about my dad for the first time without trying to change the subject. Maybe that was enough. Maybe silence was its own kind of sorry. One afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, Zoe, I'm one of the soldiers your father saved. That day in Kandahar, I was the guy pinned down behind the third Humvee. He could have stayed safe, but he didn't. He came back for me. I have a wife now, a baby girl. I named her Danielle. Thank you for reminding the world who he was. I will never forget his name. Or yours. I read it 3 times before I could even breathe. I folded it carefully, slid it into the same box where I kept his last letter, and placed it beneath my bed. That night I dreamed of him. He didn't say much. Just looked at me, smiled, and nodded the kind of nod that says, You did it, Zoe. You did it right. The next morning I wore his boots again. Not because it was a special day, but because now, every day was. It's funny how everything can change but still look the same. The halls still smell like old textbooks and cafeteria tater tots. The lockers still jam. The bell still rings 2 minutes too early. But there's a quiet difference now, like the school is breathing a little deeper, listening more, remembering better. I walk these halls and people nod, not out of pity or because they feel bad, but because they know. They know my name, they know his name, and they understand why sometimes I still wear the boots. Not for style, not for shock, but for honor. Flashback. One of the last nights I spent with my dad, we sat on the floor in the living room playing chess. I was frustrated losing. He looked at me and said, Zoe, some battles are loud, some are quiet. But the hardest ones, they're the ones where you stand your ground, even when no one's watching. Back then I didn't get it. Now I do. I stopped by the memorial wall again. This time I wasn't alone. A few students had left flowers. Someone taped a letter beneath my father's photo. It read, Your daughter made us remember. Thank you for everything. I didn't cry. I smiled. At lunch, Carlos from Chem sat next to me again. So did Misha and Emily. The girl who once joked about Normandy now offered me half her cookie. No one made a big deal out of it. No one needed to. That's the thing about respect. Once it's earned honestly, it doesn't need to shout. The next assembly came a week later. This time there were no helicopters, no surprise announcements. Just the student body gathered, the lights dimmed, and a short video projected on the screen. It was a tribute to military families at Lincoln High, the kids who carry unseen stories. Pictures flashed across the screen. Names, branches, dates. And then mine. A photo of me and my dad from when I was 6. I was sitting on his shoulders holding a sparkler, grinning. He was in uniform. He wasn't smiling at the camera, he was smiling at me. When the photo faded, the words below remained. Some heroes leave boots too big to fill, so their children learn to walk taller. After the video ended, the entire auditorium stood in silence. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. These days, people ask if I'm going into the military. I don't know. Maybe. But whether I do or not, I'll carry what my dad gave me. Not just in patches or medals, but in the way I speak, the way I show up, the way I remember. Because remembrance isn't about looking back. It's about moving forward with meaning. So if you're hearing my voice now, I hope you take this with you. We all pass people who are carrying more than we see. Some carry medals. Some carry grief. Some carry stories they're not ready to tell. Be kind. Be quiet enough to hear them. And when the time comes, stand with them. Say their names. Let them be remembered out loud. Because sometimes the loudest kind of love is the one that speaks gently and never forgets. If this story moved, you share it with someone who still remembers a name they haven't said in years. Or say it out loud yourself. Let them know you haven't forgotten. And neither have we.